Hello everyone and welcome to another video where today I wanted to make a very important point about foraging in general, specifically the survival side of it. Specifically, what I wanted to talk about today has mostly to do with trails. Anyone who's done enough camping and hiking to be familiar with the forest is most familiar with this side of it. And I mean, rightly so, you should try to stay on trails if you are hiking, not just because that way you don't get lost, but also because the trails are there for a reason. Hiking tends to disrupt the ecosystem a little bit, so if you keep everything to specific trails, you're doing the forest a favor. But there is something that you should know, something very pertinent to survival, and that is the fact that a lot of the most common and familiar wild edibles, like dandelion, raspberries and blackberries, wild carrots, those all really like trails. They grow very readily on the sides of them. And if all you know is walking in trails in the woods, then you might be in a false sense of security thinking that wild edibles are incredibly common in the forest. And that's simply not true. Especially if you have some foraging knowledge, you might be in a little bit of a shock if you're not aware of this. And shock is not a good thing in a survival situation. It's not exactly a good feeling if you're pretty sure of your foraging knowledge, and then when you get lost in the woods, you're thinking, where's the food? I can't find any. Now, that's not to say that there aren't wild edibles off the beaten path in the forest. There are. For example, this field garlic is very common due to its life cycle coinciding with the time when trees will typically drop their leaves. While there are wild edibles in the forest, they tend to be less prevalent than you'd be led to expect if you've just been hiking on trails. When it comes to wild plants, the fact of the matter is that there's plenty of trees that are making it hard for anything to photosynthesize down here. If you're just familiar with trails, you might take a look at some of this and go, well, look at all this field garlic, all these wild carrots, there's ducks around, all that sort of stuff. You might think with those few wild edibles, you're good, you don't need to learn anymore because they're so plentiful. But the problem is, as you may have already guessed, if you're lost in the woods and you need to find food to survive, chances are quite good you're probably not on a trail. Now, of course, if you are in a survival situation, food is not a priority. And oftentimes, if you are generally familiar with foraging, you may forget that, but keep in mind that getting water, shelter, and fire is far more important. So with all this, in my opinion, there's a few takeaways. The first is that you need to realize that in the open woodlands, food can be a little difficult to find. Once you understand that, you might not panic if you do find yourself in a survival situation in the woods and you can't find food. Second, while food is great to have, it is not as important as many other things in survival. Shelter, water, fire, those are all much more important. And third is to learn as many wild edibles as possible, even ones that you might not want to eat normally, but, if you're very hungry, you're out there for a few days, you haven't been found yet, your stomach's making noises, and you're not thinking quite straight, it's good to have backups to eat if you need to. Overall, foraging's a wonderful and useful hobby. And if you can identify one plant, you're better off than someone who can identify 0, but just because you can figure out that this is a wild carrot doesn't mean you'll be able to survive out in the woods. Anyway, I hope you all learned something and enjoyed. See ya.